Welcome back to Cultivate Talk. Today's conversation asks us to rethink something many of us take for granted: how we understand land, space, and even death. I'm joined by Dr. Deondre Smiles, whose research sits at the intersection of Indigenous geographies, political ecology, and cultural resource preservation. His work explores Indigenous relationships to space, including burial grounds, ancestral lands, and more than human kin, and examines how these relationships are often misunderstood or erased within the dominant settler frameworks. In this episode, we talk about the political dimensions of Indigenous death, the ongoing struggles over burial sites and ancestral remains, and how these conflicts reveal broader dynamics of power, governance, and communication. We also explore how Indigenous relational frameworks, particularly the connections between people, land, water, animals, and plants, challenge Western ways of thinking about environment, ownership, and responsibility, especially in the context of climate crisis. This is a conversation that invites us to listen more carefully, think more critically, and reconsider the assumptions that shape how we understand the world around us. Let's get into it. So thank you so much for being here today to talk to me about your work, Dr. Smiles. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. It's a beautiful day here in Victoria, BC, and feeling good and awake. How are you?
I am doing well, thank you. So, to kind of kick us off, your work examines Indigenous relationships to space, including burial grounds and ancestral lands. How do dominant settler frameworks fundamentally misunderstand what these spaces mean to Indigenous communities?
Mm. That's a good question and a very important one. I think at the heart of this misunderstanding is the concept of value of certain spaces. And so I just finished a couple of years ago some archival research around the different conceptions of settler burial spaces versus indigenous burial spaces. And what I found from my archival work was that there has been a tremendous upswelling of attention, of scholarship, of community engagement in non-Indigenous communities surrounding identifying old cemeteries, preserving them, trying to keep some historic record of them. Because the argument is that you don't want people to forget about these spaces, one, so that we can properly commemorate the dead, and two, so that you don't disturb those spaces if you wanted to build a road or dig for utilities or build a pipeline. And so I found that there were all kinds of, in the geographical context that I did this in was northeastern Minnesota, where I spent a decent amount of time, and I'm from Minnesota originally. Is that there's all kinds of attention paid to, like the histories of all of these European cemeteries and very detailed histories of when they were established and who's responsible for them now. But then when you hear about Indigenous burial sites being disturbed or being discovered, one of the most common refrains that you hear from certain segments of society is, well, why didn't they properly mark them, right? Or, just because somebody's buried there doesn't make it a cemetery. Or even outwardly questioning, well, is this really a cemetery? How do we know that there are bodies there? And there is this sort of, what I say, burden of proof that's put upon Indigenous peoples that doesn't get put upon non-Indigenous peoples. For example, if I were to go to the local cemetery and put a shovel in the ground, I could reasonably expect to get arrested in short order because I'd be committing crime and desecrating an important burial site. Right. But when an Indigenous burial site gets disturbed in a similar manner, there's a lot of hand wringing and a lot of conversation around, oh, well, how did we know that this was a cemetery? And, there needs to be better historical records kept. And what I found is that there actually are historical records that are kept, like oral histories, written histories, but it comes down to the value of the land, where Indigenous burial sites are not viewed as these spaces of mourning and of memory and of commemoration, but rather they're viewed as these very unfortunate, very annoying obstacles to development, things that can be, quote, weaponized by Indigenous peoples to stop development that they don't agree with, which it's actually far more multifaceted and nuanced than that. But when you come from a certain point of view that anything that's not European based, not Christian based, in its history or its continued maintenance, there's oftentimes this kind of accompanying narrative that it's not really truly worth saving or not really truly worth protecting. But that's where Indigenous nations come in and say, well, no, these spaces are really truly important to us. Just because we don't mark them in the same way that you do doesn't make them any less important. And if you actually pay attention to us, we are telling you very clearly about the histories of these spaces and why they are important. And so don't be surprised when, if you disturb a burial site, we're going to step up and resist against this, because we've made very clear to you in various ways how deeply disrespectful this is. It's just that you don't want to listen to us.
Yeah, that is like so beautifully articulated for those who might be familiar with your work and this particular focus in the discipline and those who are not. So, thank you so much. That is wonderful and really well explained. So, you use this phrase, the political agency of Indigenous death, which is incredibly powerful. Can you explain what that means and why death itself becomes a political site under settler colonialism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have to thank one of my PhD dissertation committee members for this idea. Actually, Dr. Matt Coleman is a professor at the Department of Geography at The Ohio State University. He's actually the chair of the department now. And he was the first person that really raised this idea around the political lives and agency of the dead, where he said something when I was going through my comprehensive exams, kind of this kind of milestone, these exams that you take at the midpoint of your doctoral degree, where he said, well, Deondre, what you're really talking about here is that that death is not the word he used, or the phrase he used was that death is not a political terminus. What he means by that is that death is not the end of any kind of political agency or political ability or power that a body has. Because if we take a look at the way that we talk about politics and political participation in the United States, in Canada, pretty widely around the Western world nowadays, we talk about agency politically as being wielded by the living, because living people vote, right? Dead people don't vote. As a matter of fact, when dead people vote, it's considered voter fraud, and we consider that to be a bad thing. And we say, well, dead people can't vote, they can't push for policy, they have no voice because, well, they're dead. And so therefore we don't really need to account for the dead in any political decisions that we make in the here and now, because it's not really going to affect them, besides maybe some gestures towards, well, we want to honor their memory, or we want to try to live up to the ideals that they've set for us. But in the actual applied definition of agency, the dead really don't have a voice. Now, in the work that I do in this context of the political agency of Indigenous death, I'm making the argument that Indigenous deceased actually do have a lot to still contribute to the political lives of our nations. And so if somebody passes away and they're buried, or they are handled and disposed of in whatever manner is culturally appropriate for their community, that doesn't necessarily mean that their ability to influence political actions all of a sudden stops just because they're not voting, just because they may not be participating in the ways that we typically understand as being politically engaged. In the work that I do, for example, the fact that Indigenous nations have developed some very robust protocols around the treatment of the dead, robust protocols around the treatment of burial spaces, robust protocols around institutions such as museums and hospitals and schools holding on to the remains of Indigenous peoples. These sorts of things are done with the dead in mind, that the dead are essentially able to animate and influence these acts of political sovereignty even after they have passed on. They may not be sitting there, speaking to the decision makers in real time, but people are still taking them into account, and they are still able to mobilize sustained and effective resistance against disrespectful uses and treatment of Indigenous dead. So that leads me to kind of the second part of the answer to the question around, well, why does death itself become a political site under settler colonialism? Well, I think it does so in two different ways that I'll expand upon here. One of them is kind of the idea that the settler colonial state has its claws in Indigenous peoples from the moment they are born, that we are born into a certain political category based on our descendancy, that we have certain rights that may be honored or not honored. based on our Indigenous identity, that we are kind of viewed as an other by the state, depending on where you're at in the United States or Canada, either an other to be completely ignored or an other to be tokenized and used in very kind of harmful and very extractive ways. But you would think that, well, the moment you die, that the state doesn't have any cause to do anything with you anymore. And with my own work, I've actually argued that, well, no, actually, when you die, then when the state conducts a death investigation and an autopsy on you, that's a way that the state can continue to have an influence on your body. The disturbance of Indigenous burial sites by infrastructure development, that's the way that the state and its associated actors can still act upon you. And even, with the question of like repatriation and what's to be done with, Indigenous remains and Indigenous artifacts that should be returned to communities, that becomes yet another space where death becomes kind of this contested sort of nature. And so one of it is, kind of the idea that you would think that, oh, when you die, you'll escape the clutches of colonialism. Well, no, you don't. Actually, it becomes just a new site of contestation. But then it also becomes a contestation over, this kind of the question of the political agency of the dead, where one side will say, well, no, the dead have no political power, whereas another side is saying, well, no, they actually do have power, and they can actually do a lot to help influence the ways that we make laws and come up with regulations to help protect the living. And so death itself becomes this, to use the kind of the lay theoretical term, right? It becomes these grounds of conflict between the state and Indigenous peoples, where the meaning of it and what does it mean for the futures of communities and what does it mean for the deceased themselves becomes something to be fought over.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, and that is beyond fascinating. And again, really well articulated and explained. So, how do struggles over burial grounds and Indigenous remains reveal broader power dynamics between Indigenous nations and the settler state?
Hmm. So struggles over burial grounds and Indigenous remains really unpack the deeply asymmetric power relations between Indigenous peoples and the state, but also the asymmetric ways in which resistance can play out. And so the power dynamics between Indigenous nations and the settler state, we'll use the United States as an example. There's
Okay.
the general legal doctrine and precedent that Indigenous nations are supposed to be co-sovereigns with the United States, we have a nation to nation relationship with the federal government, that we have a state to state relationship with state governments, and that we're supposed to be viewed as equal partners. But when it comes to the disturbances of Indigenous burial sites and the frequency in which they happen and the uneven nature in which the state or the federal government responds to it, when it comes to the federally mandated repatriation of Indigenous remains under the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, and the ways that institutions have been able to essentially dig their heels in and say, oh, well, we need these for research, or we can't identify the community that these come from, so we can't return them, essentially finding ways to continue to hold on to those remains for research. It kind of shows that this supposed relationship between sovereigns is anything but from the settler colonial point of view, where Indigenous peoples are coming from this generally saying, hey, we're supposed to be, partners in this, and you're supposed to be working with us. But, the idea of being equals starts to run a bit shallow when it comes to things that directly benefit the state. And so, to quote, what's the novel, right? Animal Farm, that some animals are, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It's kind of that same thing where Indigenous peoples are supposed to have sovereignty, but that sovereignty only extends so far that it doesn't threaten the colonial states. And death happens to be one of those areas where if an Indigenous community wants to push back against, the building of an apartment building or a golf course because it might disturb a burial site, then they start being viewed less as co-sovereigns and more of like that annoying little community that's getting in the way of development and progress, right? Or when they're talking about repatriation, they're viewed as anti-scientific and trying to get in the way of knowledge dissemination, not something that's actually been written about in books that you can actually buy online, right? That spend their time talking about how repatriation is some scam industry rather than actually respecting the dead. And so it really kind of shows that this dynamic is really uneven when it comes to the application of power. But the other side of it too is that Indigenous communities, because of the way that they protect the dead, because of the ways that they have found, very creative and very powerful ways of protecting the dead, it also shows a bit of a power inequity that leans against the settler state, where Indigenous communities have said, okay, well, if you're not going to play ball with us and you're not going to respect the dead via your own legal principles and your own practices, and we are going to find ways of doing it ourselves, in ways that can't be easily curtailed by the courts or curtailed by money and power and privilege. And it puts the settler state into a bit of a bind, where if Indigenous communities are kind of doing these protection, coming up with ordinances around protection, or, helping to block access to burial sites in a way that doesn't immediately legitimize, the use of force, the use of punitive measures against them, it gets really tough for the settler states to start to justify this, because people will start to ask, well, they're not doing anything wrong. Why are you calling the cops on them? Or why are you trying to curtail their political rights? And it starts to turn into something where the settler state says, okay, well, we can't really stop them from doing this, and so we need to actually cooperate with them. And so that power imbalance does actually balance itself out in various ways, but I would be lying if I didn't say that it sometimes is a bit of an upward hill to climb for Indigenous communities to make sure that our ancestors are being protected and being looked after in a good way.
Absolutely. And that's interesting, because I have heard about, the Indigenous communities being disrespected, and there is being a unequal power in these situations. And so knowing that there are some situations where that kind of evens out is very interesting, and also just like really fun to kind of hear about, given that kind of aiming for that equal power versus that equity.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So you connect so-called traditional cultural resource management to environmental protection and more than human kin. How does this relationship challenge Western separations between culture, nature, and governance?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I know I happen to have the questions handy. The traditional is in quotation marks, and I actually really appreciate that, because there's this kind of idea, with like traditional ecological knowledge or traditional practices, that they all must be based in kind of old ways of doing things. This happens a lot when I teach about, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, and but then I talk about, well, communities will use modern technology. We use LiDAR, we use remote sensing, we use GIS, we use metal detectors, we use all of these different things in order to help protect our environment. And people will say, well, why would they do that, right? That's not traditional. And I say, well, traditional it does a lot of work in TEK, right? It does a lot of work because it gestures towards the fact that we are building off of practices that we've done for generations, for millennia, but it also can temporalize this. And what I mean by that, it's a really a $5 word, basically meaning that it kind of puts us in the past. And I say, well, innovation is a tradition as well in many Indigenous communities, and so we have to embrace the tools that we have, right? Why would we work harder in order to do the same work when we do have modern technology at our hand, just because we're Indigenous, just because we might follow traditional life ways? Doesn't mean that we are beholden to the past. I mean, you see me wearing modern clothing. I'm wearing a flannel. I'm talking to you on a webcam on a computer on my home office, right?
Right.
I mean, we don't have a traditional practice for that, but we've come to embrace it, right? Because we are modern peoples as well. So when it comes to the idea of cultural resource management and connecting that to environmental protection and more than human kin, this really builds off of something that I discovered during my dissertation research, in that the communities that really had robust, practices around protecting burial sites, around protecting remains in historical sites, were able to translate what they had learned from that protection to protection of the living environment. In particular, I remember a story on my own home reservation where I was driving around with our tribal historic preservation officer, and we were driving along a highway that was undergoing an archaeological survey. They wanted to expand the highway, and the local historic preservation office needed to make sure that there were no burial sites nearby. And they did the survey. They were quite efficient at it, and they found that there was no burials that would be impacted. But the historic preservation officer, or TIPO is the acronym, she said, well, there's more to it than just remains. And she had me pull over on the side of the road, and we kind of went down into like this drainage ditch, and she pointed out all these different plants that were growing, and she says, well, these are medicines for our people. And she said, well, if you're digging up the road, if you are rebuilding it, you might impact those medicines as well. And we need to make sure that our people have access to those as well. And so she said, we do these surveys not just to identify archaeological sites. We do so because we want to identify any environmental impact that might occur as well, and that might impact the ability of our peoples to exercise our treaty rights. And so that was really a light bulb moment for me, where I felt, okay, so I'm trying to figure out, well, why is it that we do all of this work in the first place, right? Is it just merely to protect the dead? And then from there, I began to realize that, well, no, it's more about actually protecting all parts of the environment, that the dead are part of the environment, but also what we call our more than human kin. So like plants, animals, water, air, our broader environment. That's also really important to protect. And when we come up with these robust practices around protecting the dead, a side benefit of it is that we end up protecting the living as well, because we can easily use the same ordinances, the same practices, and try to stop any impact to our broader environment, which in northern Minnesota, with logging and pipeline construction and road construction and mining and all sorts of extractive industries and practices going on, becomes also vitally important. If we just protect the burial sites, but then we happen to lose access to a stand of important plants that we use for medicines, that's also a huge impact to our heritage and to our culture. And so that's kind of where I've started to really try to merge kind of these areas together and say, well, actually, when we talk about cultural resource management, we're not just talking about the dead, but we're rather thinking of a more holistic, like full life cycle form of protection. So in regard to your question, well, how does this challenge Western separations between culture, nature, and governance? As a geographer, I oftentimes will teach my students about kind of the history of our discipline as being one where we talk about the environment as being something that we have to hold ourselves apart from. That people in kind of a Western dominant paradigm say, well, you can't be embedded with what you're studying, right? You can't be embedded with the environment, because if you do so, then you're going to be biased and you're not going to be able to make objective observations of what's going on. But as I've seen from my own experience, from my own cultural teachings, as well as the work that I've done, I make the argument that, well, how can you not be connected to your broader environment, right? I can't separate myself from the broader environment. I can't just magically, teleport myself to 100,000 feet above the earth and look down and say, okay, well, here's what I can observe, right? If something happens, I get affected by it. One of the examples I like to give, that little bit of dark humor, I guess, is that, at some point, it could be 5 minutes from now, it could be 50 years from now. Here on the West Coast, we are supposed to get a major earthquake, like you're talking magnitude 9.0.
Right.
When it happens, if I'm still around to be affected by it, I can't just magically stop the earthquake and be like, oh, well, what impact is this going to have? I'm going to be ducking for cover and trying to make sure that my wife and our cat and our pets are okay, and that my friends and family are okay. When we talk about climate change, right? When we talk about warming temperatures, increased climatic instability, we can't separate ourselves from that. We're going to be affected by that. When we talk about, polluting waterways or polluting the earth, we can't separate ourselves from that. There's no way that we can, power and privilege allows certain groups to maybe not be as affected by it as others. But I say that, pollution, climate change, climate apocalypse, emergencies, they don't know boundaries. They don't know borders. They don't suddenly stop just because a certain neighborhood has a higher socioeconomic level than a different neighborhood, right? And so this really kind of challenges, kind of the idea of holding ourselves apart. And I say, well, there's no possible way we can hold ourselves apart. And the sooner that we recognize that we can't, the sooner that we can actually come up with solutions that actually can help people, rather than just simply putting a Band-Aid on broader issues of climate injustice and equity.
That is beautiful, which I know I keep saying, but your explanation and articulation is probably one of my most favorite things I've ever heard within this discipline. And that is spanning my entire education and professional experience, because the holistic approach to connecting to the environment in such a way, I think, is something that many people just don't necessarily think about in depth. And so I think that is a beautiful explanation. And my next question is like what you said is a good segue to my next question, because continuing this conversation on this more than human kin, so like the animals, plants, water, the general environment, as you were mentioning, how does centering these relationships reshape how we think about responsibility, care, survival in an era of climate crisis?
Hmm. And that's the important question, right? Is we are hurtling into this climate apocalypse, this climate hellscape, as I like to call it. But what do we do about it?
Yeah.
There's this kind of growing sense that we can somehow tech our way out of this. That's why you see people starting to lean on Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And what I call tech bros is being this the salvation for humanity, right? And there's beginning to talk about oh, well, maybe we need to go into outer space and give the Earth a chance to heal. But I'm kind of the fly in the ointment, the squeaky wheel that says, okay, so why are they saying this? Who gets served by leaving the Earth? Why is it that the people that are responsible for large scale environmental destruction are the ones that are also charged with somehow getting us out of it, right? What they don't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. There's this saying, right? There's no ethical billionaire, and I really do actually strongly agree with that, to kind of show my little bit of my political leanings, right? That you don't make that much money out of the goodness of your heart. You don't make that much money out of without harming people, without stepping on top of people, without destroying the environment in various sorts of ways. Even Elon Musk and Tesla. People. My I guess soon to be ex brother-in-law said once. Oh, if you want to save the environment, just buy a Tesla. And I'm like, well, there's a lot more to it than that. People can't afford Teslas. There's a political connotations of owning a Tesla nowadays. I think that they're kind of ugly vehicles. No offense if you drive one or if people drive one. I no judgment, but I mean, I've seen the cyber trucks around, and I'm like, that's not the vehicle that I would want to be driving around in. But even like electric vehicles. Well, where do you get the batteries from? Well, they're built using rare earth elements and minerals that you have to mine out of the ground. That's why in Canada right now we're seeing in the Ring of Fire in northern Ontario this huge rush to begin to tap into or unlock the mineral wealth of the region. But Indigenous communities are saying this could pollute the environment, this could pollute water,
Mm-hmm.
this could pollute the land. And so this kind of idea of us high-teching our way out of climate crisis, I think, is not really going to be helpful for the vast majority of humanity. Instead, I think that we need to lean back into having a true relationship with the land. And so when I talk about geography, somebody's like, well, how do you experience geography? Because I talk about geography as being an experience. I'm like, well, go outside, go to one of your favorite places, and how do you feel, right? And how that connection. I'll give you an example of my favorite place here on Vancouver Island, the far west coast of the island, in Tofino and Ucluelet is well known for its sandy beaches. Beautiful weather year round. I mean, it's sunny during the summer and then during the fall and the winter, which is actually my favorite time of the year. It's very cloudy and rainy and just very misty there in the rainforest. But that connection to that place means that if something's going to destroy it, I'm going to have a strong reaction, and I'm going to say, well, what can I do to ensure that this place doesn't get destroyed? Right? That talks about kind of that personal connection, that embodied connection, and that's actually at the heart of like when I talk about Indigenous geographies. As an Indigenous geographer, I say, well, it's about our connection to space and place and how it is very much embodied within us. Again, how we can't hold ourselves separate, but rather need to embrace and really just accept that we are interconnected with the environment in ways that can help us or can harm us. I think about the world creation story of my people at Turtle Island, which is essentially the short version of it is a story about how animals group together in order to help create a new world, the world that we live on, out of the floods that covered the old one. And the moral of the story is that everybody has to work together, that no one person, no one being is more important than the other. But I go a little bit further because humans don't figure into the Turtle Island story. And I actually do that on purpose because when I tell my students about it or I tell folks about it, I say, well, do you notice something's missing? And eventually they'll say, oh, yeah, well, humans. And I'm like, well, what does this mean? And they'll think about it. And then I kind of tell them I can usually tell if it's going to be a really good class, depending on if somebody gets it. And sometimes somebody will say, well, does that mean that we're like not as important as the other animals? And I say, well, essentially, yes, we are the least important part of the ecosystem because we came last, right? This was created for us and we came here. And so we're guests on this land. We are guests in this environment. And I won't speak for, your listeners or viewers as protocols when they're a guest in somebody's house, but like when I go over to somebody's house, I follow their rules. I don't kind of say, okay, well, I'm going to follow my own rules. I'm a respectful guest. I try to make sure that I leave places better than I found it, and that I, make sure that I'm being a good steward of resources and not taking more than I need and being respectful. And the same thing goes with the environment from an Indigenous point of view, that we need to make sure that we are being respectful and recognizing the sacrifice and the hard work that has come into creating this world. Before humans came along, there was 4.6 billion years of evolution and change that came, that created the earth that we have it today. And we are irrevocably changing all of this work in the span of like years, if not, not decades and centuries. And I'm like, well, who are we to do that, right? What right do we have to try to change the environment to fit us when, really a real relational way of doing it is, well, how do we adapt our practices to be in better relation with the environment? So I'll step off my soapbox there.
No,
And
that's
the next question.
that's great. I love the stories that you mentioned that you tell your students to make those connections. I think that's great. So you argue that these struggles open up new political possibilities for all living beings. What might those possibilities look like if Indigenous relational frameworks were taken seriously in policy or governance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it'll be really generative and really iterative, that it really can change based on the environmental realities around us and the specific frameworks that you're using, because no two Indigenous communities are going to be alike in the way that they relate to the environment. But again, I'll give an example or two. So out here on the West Coast, there are fish farms where companies will essentially breed and grow and create fish to be sold, for food or to be exported to other countries for food or other means. And every so often, these fish farms, for folks that haven't seen them, are like these usually big floating platforms with like different like pens where they'll have like the different fish in the spawn. And maybe a few buildings for the workers to monitor them. They'll be floating out in like inlets or like, just off the coast in the ocean. A couple of years ago, one of these fish farms got broken into. Essentially, a group of sea lions discovered that, oh, hey, there's this place with a ton of food. Why don't we go into the fish farm? Because there's nothing really stopping them from going in besides these very shallow buoys and pens. And they basically swam into the fish farm and they set up shop there. And they started gorging themselves on the fish. And the company was freaking out. They were like, oh my God, what do we do? They're going to eat all the fish and we're not going to be able to make any money. And they actually had to abandon the fish farm. They couldn't get the sea lions to go away. And so now my wife and I actually got to see the fish farm when we were on a sea otter viewing tour, as the boat captain took us out to this fish farm and said, oh yeah, you see all these sea lions? And there's probably like 40 or 50 sea lions sitting on top of like the platform to the point where it's starting to like sink into the water. And he said, yeah, they've basically taken it over. They've closed the farm. Like there's nothing they can do because the sea lions have discovered the food here. And obviously they're not going to leave. And I'm like, well, why would they, right? It's free food. It's easily accessible. And they're going to do what sea lions are going to do, which is to eat. And there was a lot of when this break-in first happened, right back in 2022, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of hand-wringing around a couple of things. One of them was from the economic side. Well, how do we get these sea lions out of here? They're going to basically destroy this profitable fish farm. And then people on the other side were saying, oh, well, what happens if the sea lions get sick? Or, what happens to what happens to fish biodiversity and all these different things? And I'm sitting here asking, well, what did both sides expect if you were going to basically have a ready, willing, accessible source of food there for sea lions to come access, right? It would be the equivalent of me setting up a full buffet in the middle of a crowded convention hall or something like that and saying, oh, have at it. It's free. Go for it. Even if like somebody else, let's say my co-organizer was like, whoa, we were planning on charging for that. But by that point, I'd be like, well, these people are already taking food. We can't really stop them, right? It's
Right.
It's human nature, right? Or, for our friends that have dogs and cats at home that might be counter surfers, right? People say, well, how do I get my dog to stop counter surfing? Well, it's really tough to do so because it's in the dog's nature, right? They're going to take easy food, right? Same thing with cats. And so where I'm going with all of this, um, kind of these new political possibilities, I'm like, well, maybe have you talked to like the local indigenous communities? How might they have viewed that fish farm, right? Would they agree with you that this was a good thing to be harvesting fish that maybe might be an invasive species here? Might they say, would they say, oh, well, we better get those sea lions off? Or might they say, well, the sea lions are just going to do what the sea lions are going to do, right? You should have expected this. There's kind of this idea that we can constrain and control nature, and we try to, as human beings, we try to in so many different ways, right? Whether it's the draining of water in the Netherlands to create polders, or the creation of dams, or diverting floodwaters, or trying to build in places that may not be the most environmentally sustainable to build. We are constantly trying to prove our superiority as human beings by trying to essentially push back against nature. Just ask the folks in New Orleans who have discovered that building a city in a giant bowl underneath sea level is maybe not the best idea in the world. I think that taking a look at a more relational framework might be kind of understanding all the different aspects of, an environmental decision, understanding, who gets affected, not just human beings, but different animals. Like, does water get affected by this? Does air quality get affected by this? Does plant biodiversity get affected by this? And trying to make decisions that are not just based on economic benefit, or what's going to benefit us, but what's going to be good for the broader environment, which can be really difficult for folks, because that means that sometimes it may not be a good idea to do the thing that we think we need to do to make money or make life better, right? We may have to think about different ways. People view that as an impediment to progress. And I say, well, no, it actually just opens up the possibilities for more living things to be able to share in this future, right? And we are an innovative species. I mean, if you go back 100 years ago, you think people would have imagined that we would be having this conversation here right now?
Right.
Probably not. No. And so we have to lean into that innovation. We need to lean into that relational way of doing things, because it's more than just us, right? We only get one Earth. We only get one environment, right? Once we destroy this one, there's not another one for us to be able to flee to. And so that takes away not only our agency, but takes away the agency of our more than human kin. And so that relational model is not putting humans first, right? Not being anthrocentric, but rather viewing everything as being interconnected and holistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes perfect sense. So, research ethics are a key part of your work. What does ethical, community engaged research look like when studying deeply sensitive issues like death, burial, and ancestral remains?
Yeah, this is, I won't sugarcoat it. I know for myself, it was very emotionally draining work, and I was just the one kind of conducting the research. I would talk to folks about this type of work. And sometimes we would be talking about extremely sensitive topics. As a matter of fact, I would say that probably some of the most impactful things that I had heard from my research collaborators — I never call them my participants, but rather collaborators, because they're helping me to create this knowledge — some of that stuff will never see the light of any book or any article, right? Some of the stuff I would carry around a tape recorder, some of it I turned it off, because this was really deeply powerful stuff, like people telling me like where their ancestors might be buried, or talking about the impact that they might have with dealing with contestations over death through autopsy, or through the disturbances of burial sites. Ethics is important with any sort of topic that's dealing with indigenous peoples, but with death and burials and ancestral remains, it becomes even more important to do the work ethically, because this is really deeply emotional work. For some indigenous cultures, some communities, it's deeply spiritual in nature, right? And so we want to be careful that we're not running afoul of any sort of kind of spiritual guidelines, or any kind of community cultural sensitivity guidelines. And so research ethics for me, when I teach students about this, and I'm actually teaching about research ethics this week in one of my courses, one of the things I say is, well, communication, right? That you need to talk to people, you need to be open to hearing what they have to say. And with this kind of work, it becomes even more vitally important. Like, what can I share? What should I not share? Even if they say, oh, go ahead and share it, do I use my own judgment and say, oh, maybe I don't feel comfortable with putting this knowledge out there?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I ran into in my dissertation research is, one of my committee members was, when they saw my first draft of my dissertation, they were like, oh, well, this needs more maps. And I'm like, well, I don't know that I feel comfortable mapping out some of these spaces where I'm doing this work, right? Are you asking me to map out where there is these burial sites that communities have? When they just got done telling me that they don't put this information out there because people will go and start digging them up, searching for artifacts or treasure. Like, I can't do that, right? Or if somebody tells me, oh, hey, there is this burial site here that's really deeply significant to our people. Um, I have to ask myself the question: can I ethically share this? And in that case, they were clear, like, you shouldn't share this. And I was like, well, I probably wouldn't anyways, right? Because I don't want that being disturbed. That people have a right to privacy, and I'm already talking about deeply emotional stuff, and so my job is to do as little harm as possible in the work that I'm doing, and I try not to do any harm at all, right? But the emotional sensitivity of the work means that I got to be really careful, and I need to be respectful in communicating with people and be really open and honest about the work that I'm doing. Even 6 years after I've defended my dissertation, I still talk regularly with my research participants, and I check in with them. And I'm writing a book about this right now, and I'm going to check in with them and be like, does this represent your words? Does this, is this okay? Like, am I okay to represent your words in this way? And if they say no, instead of, being defensive and saying, oh, well, you're just trying to stifle knowledge, or why are you being so difficult? My obligation is to go back and say, okay,
Yeah.
on which grounds would you feel comfortable? Do you want me to just omit things completely? Do you want me to anonymize you? Do you want me to rewrite things? This type of work is so deeply impactful and significant to communities that I want to try to reduce the impact that I create wherever possible. And so ethics for me is, communicating consent, ongoing consent, making sure that they know what I'm doing at all times, and making sure that I'm representing their voices, not filtered through a lens of what I think people want to hear from them, but rather what they want to hear. There are folks that I interviewed for my dissertation that, they were, agreed with my views. I interviewed folks that were very vehemently against, Indigenous burial site protections for various reasons. I still have to represent their voices accurately, right? I can't just be like, oh, well, they're a bad person because we're misaligned in our views. I might say, well, I don't agree with them, and I think that this might be indicative of like a harmful way of doing things. But I have to be clear that that's coming from my point of view, and I can't misrepresent their words in order to prove a point. And so, for me, that's how ethical work with sensitive issues like death, burial, ancestral remains goes, but also other things such as cultural histories, oral histories. You just got to be really protective wherever possible. And so I always just say I communicate. I almost over communicate as a function, right? Because I'm like, I need you to know what I'm doing at all times. I don't want you to ever be curious. What's that Smiles fellow doing with like the stories that we've told him? It's like, you'll know at all times, right? And it's worked fairly well. I mean, there's been challenges. I definitely have had my share of. I got yelled at on the phone by an elder once when I was very new and inexperienced, and kind of like, well, why are you asking about this? That's kind of invasive, don't you think? And at first I was like, oh my gosh, this feels really uncomfortable. I'm being kind of like yelled at by an elder, and now I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't blame him, right? And maybe I would have been a little nicer if I would have been in this position, but like, research sometimes has taken on a bit of a bad connotation in Indigenous communities because people will come in, take data, take stories, take knowledge, and they'll leave and they'll win grants with it and publish books and build a career for themselves. And the community will never see any benefits come from it at all. And as a matter of fact, there's been some really deeply harmful things that have happened with extractive research practices. And so I'm like, communities have the rights to vet me and to be, and to not immediately trust me, even though I'm an Indigenous researcher. My obligation is to demonstrate that their stories and that their knowledge is safe with me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think your response highlights, I know you mentioned how important ethics is in general with Indigenous communities, but from a research standpoint, I think your response really highlights the necessary mindfulness it takes to ethically do this work and to put it out for those to read and rely upon for their own education. So that mindfulness, I imagine, is incredibly important in the work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
So, my final question for you is you've also expressed interest in Indigenous geographies of outer space, which sounds incredibly fascinating. How do Indigenous spatial logics help us rethink exploration, ownership, and responsibility beyond Earth?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's been a really new and exciting area of growth for me in my scholarship. with Indigenous geographies of outer space, really, I view it as really an analogy for the ways that we kind of frame our relationship to earthly space. And so, in the article that I wrote around Indigenous, geographies of outer space and settler colonial kind of conceptions of outer space, kind of this idea of land ownership and extraction of extraterrestrial environments kind of comes into play here, where a settler colonial reading is like, well, how can we go into outer space? How can we control it? How can we gain money and wealth from it? Whereas a more Indigenous framing says, well, we're not even being a good relation here on Earth. What's to say that we're going to be respectful in outer space? And so, kind of these differences between, well, how do we engage with extraterrestrial space, even given that there's not a quote owner of outer space, right, in these geographies? And so, what do we do when we don't see an owner, right? Do we throw ethics out the window? Do we just kind of do whatever we want? And my kind of argument is that, well, no, we don't. We still need to respect the environment, even if it is away from the Earth. And so I think this really helps us to, in the area of exploration, it helps us to, I'm hoping that it'll help us to understand and ask the question, well, why is it that we are trying to expand beyond the Earth? Who gets served by this, right? What sorts of benefits are we trying to build? Are we trying to benefit humanity? Are we trying to benefit scientific knowledge production? Or are we trying to essentially come up with another mode and site of production for, wealthy capitalists? As far as ownership, right, kind of the idea that on Earth, there's very few places that are terra nullius, meaning no man's land, and the few places that are usually considered to be very marginally valuable lands, or Antarctica, which is protected by treaty. When we don't own something, right? When there's land in extraterrestrial space that we don't own, do we just lay claim to it, or do we think about what it means to engage with it without having to put a stake in it? And then responsibility beyond Earth, right? Do we have an obligation to help protect broader environments besides on Earth, or can we just do what we want because there's no people in outer space to displace or to colonize? I would argue that, well, no, our responsibilities remain the same no matter where we are, right? But using outer space is a really interesting angle to drive home some of the arguments that I'm trying to make around land relations on Earth. Is it can be effective because it gives us kind of a more faraway example, and we might say, oh yeah, well, we don't want to go and pollute outer space. Well, then if we're not going to pollute outer space, why are we doing it here on Earth, right? And if we're doing it here on Earth, we're running the risk of replicating the same practices in outer space. And for my own people, outer space is an important geography from us. It's where humanity came from, right? And so it's like, well, we need to make sure that we're respecting that space because, again, we didn't create that. That was created for us, and so we have an obligation to protect it.
Yeah, absolutely. That is fascinating to think like beyond Earth and to think about your research through the lens of like outer space. I think it's incredibly important. But this has been, your articulations of your work are just beautiful and so important and relevant to our discipline. So I really appreciate how you framed everything and for you basically just taking the time to talk with me about your work and explain the many wonderful things that you take a look at and that you teach and that you write about. I really appreciate it. Can you share a little bit about where people might be able to find your work and learn more about what you do?
Of course, yeah. So there's a couple of different places. I have my professional websites, and so my personal academic website is deondresmiles.com. That's DeonDresmiles.com. My research group, the Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratory, can be reached at Geographic Indigenous Futures. That's all one word, .ca. You can also find my articles on Google Scholar. If you just Google, go into Google Scholar and type Deondre Smiles, you can find the various works that I've published. And you can find my contact information on my website as well. So if you happen to want to get access to an article or two, I have been known to share my PDFs with folks very willingly. So always happy to talk with folks or connect about my work or help point them in productive directions if they want to know more about Indigenous geographies. That's one of my favorite things about what I do, actually, is spreading the good word and sharing this amazing subfield with as many people as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Smiles. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate it as well.
And that's our conversation with Dr. Deondre Smiles. This episode is a powerful reminder that communication is deeply tied to power. to whose voices are heard, whose knowledge is valued, and whose relationships to land and history are recognized or ignored. What stands out is the call to think beyond dominant frameworks, to consider relational ways of understanding space, care, and responsibility that extend beyond humans alone. These perspectives don't just challenge existing systems, they open up possibilities for more just and sustainable futures. As always, thank you for listening to Cultivate Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, be sure to follow the show and share it with someone who might find it meaningful. Until then, keep cultivating conversations that matter.